So now we're in World Regions Geography 110, Latin America and the Caribbean, Part 3, History, Economy, and Territory. So when we think of Latin America and the Caribbean, we think of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. But there were some other colonists in this region. The British were in Jamaica, in Belize, and in British Guyana, and in some islands in the Southern Caribbean, British Virgin Islands, some of the other islands. The Dutch were in Aruba and Suriname in Latin America, and the French were in French Guiana and Haiti and Martinique, some of the other islands in the Caribbean. So in the Caribbean, it's much more diverse. The mainland, there's really only a few places where there were anything other than Spanish, primarily Spanish, and then in Brazil, the Portuguese. Now, the reason you have that distribution of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism is this right here, the Treaty of Tordesillas. And the reason is this is when the Pope divided up the world between the two Spanish or the two Catholic countries, primary Catholic countries, Spain and Portugal. And they picked a point about 1,100 miles east of the Canary Islands and drew a line north to south, and everything east of that belonged to Portugal. That's why you see very, very little Spanish influence in Africa, and Brazil was primarily in that region, so that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese and was a Portuguese colony, and the rest of Latin America was left to the Spanish. And because the British and the French were kind of Protestant, they weren't even considered, and the Dutch, they weren't even considered as part of the equation. European exploration, early or late 15th century, early 16th century, throughout the 17th century, you had a lot of exploration throughout Latin America, throughout North and South America, for that matter, the Caribbean, globally. And you began this conquest and colonization process. And as wealth became more concentrated in Europe, largely from Spanish South America, from Mexico and from Peru, from the silver mines, the Spanish silver mines, that's where the dollar symbol that we use came from, and that's where the pirates that you read about all were raiding the Spanish shipping that was taking boatload after boatload of silver and gold to Spain and concentrating that wealth in Europe and allowing the Spanish to begin to influence European politics much more than they had previously. But that is not the only thing, but that is a major portion of it. And that had a big impact on the rush to colonize different parts of the world, and also the rise of capitalism, that acceleration of global capitalism. European conquest starting early, well, Columbus's two trips before in the 15th century really didn't do a whole lot in terms of conquest, but it was people like Pizarro and Cortez that began they conquered the Aztecs and the Incas, and that formed the basis of the Spanish Empire and the wealth of Spain, and led to lots of other explorations such as De Soto in Florida and up through the southeast part of the United States, all the way up into Arkansas and then down into Texas. The 20th century sees this region as more globally integrated. And that can be good and bad. It's good from the standpoint of having more trade, but it's probably bad in terms of culture and in terms of the impact. You're seeing migration patterns. We'll talk about that actually later. But we're going to talk about the history now and the historical legacies and landscapes. There's a couple of really important things that I want to make sure that you understand. Demographic collapse. I'm sure it'll be part of an exam that discusses Latin America, and the demographic collapse was the native populations, the demography, in other words, the birth and death rate. And it wasn't really the birth rate that dropped, it was the death rate that accelerated. In the 16th century, which is the 1500s, and the 1600s and the 17th century, you had major population drop for indigenous peoples. And it's a result of these things right here. These diseases that were brought by Europeans as part of this thing called the Columbian Exchange. And these diseases like diphtheria, influenza, malaria, measles, smallpox, typhus, whooping cough, even things as simple as a common cold could devastate native populations. And really, prior to European intervention, from a disease standpoint, if you want to read a good book on it, you can read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. It talks about it, but from a disease standpoint, the people in this region had very little, if any, natural immunities to any diseases because they didn't have any diseases. A lot of these diseases arise from man's contact with animals, and they didn't domesticate many animals. You had a couple of species down here, llamas and alpacas. You had dogs and you had turkeys up here, but you didn't really have a lot of domesticated animals. You didn't have sheep, you didn't have pigs, you didn't have horses, you didn't have cows, none of that. And that's where a lot of these diseases come from. So this European exchange had pretty severe, this Columbian exchange had a pretty severe impact. Now, the disease that went this direction was syphilis, and it had a pretty severe impact in Europe, particularly among the wealthier class. Henry VIII died of syphilis. It wasn't uncommon in Europe in the 16th, 17th century for wealthier people. So you saw a lot of things like honeybees, livestock, cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, barley, oats, rice, and wheat. None of that was over here. Prior to that, peaches and pears, coffee beans came from this region down here. Turnips, olives, onions, citrus fruits, grapes, bananas, and sugarcane all came from Europe and Asia and Africa into Latin America. On the other hand, sweet potatoes, squash, pumpkins, peppers, tobaccos, pineapples, chocolate, cocoa, and beans, vanilla beans, corn, tomatoes, avocados, one of my favorites, peanuts, and turkeys were shipped to Europe, and that became potatoes, which are up there, became dietary supplement, particularly in Northern Europe. And the reason for that was that in Northern Europe at the time, there was a little ice age going on. So potatoes and the 100 Years' War, little two minor things, and not too minor actually. And so potatoes would grow underground, which means they would survive the frost. And the other part of it was that armies didn't really burn them like they could burn a wheat field. They couldn't really burn the potatoes. They were still underground. Land and labor. It was this land need for labor for the haciendas and plantations growing these crops that were the cash crops, like the chocolate, the tobacco, and other fruits and things that they grew here that they shipped to Europe. The mines, working in the mines, the silver mines and the gold mines, these types of things required a lot of labor. Originally, they were using indigenous labor, but with the demographic collapse, that triggered slave trade from this region right down here over into here. And so this would come like this, and that's what we call the triangular trade. And then what you have, beginning in the 19th century, you begin to have all these independence movements. Haiti, 19th century, the slave revolt in Haiti created the first slave or black run government in the Americas, and that was Haiti. You have the northern part of South America, Simon Bolivar breaking away from Spain in the 1820s. You have Mexico breaking away from Spain in the early 1800s. And you begin to have all these countries breaking away from Spain as Spain grew weaker. You have geographies of indulgence, desire, and addiction, and we're talking about coffee. So they brought coffee from Ethiopia and Yemen. There's some debate about where it actually originated, but whatever the case, I know I have some every day. They brought coffee because it would grow well in Central America and Brazil and Colombia, Venezuela. They began producing it here and shipping it to Europe. It originated in Ethiopia and Yemen, and then the Dutch actually smuggled it out to Borneo and that region and began growing it there. And then the Spanish got it because they controlled the Dutch, and so they brought it to Latin America. And we have a thing called fair, that you have this tremendous consumption of coffee products globally, and you have this movement that we're all, I'm sure, aware of, fair trade coffee. And basically what fair trade coffee is saying, you're going to pay the people that are producing it a little bit more to help them to have a better lifestyle so that you can feel better about drinking your cup of coffee. I don't know that it makes it any better, a better cup of coffee, but it makes you feel better about your cup of coffee.